Hi. Today I want to talk with you about critical thinking. In this day of instant messaging and tweeting and sound bites and memes and screaming headlines, it's a skill that's all but lost to neglect and intellectual indolence. It's in great demand, but short supply. Where all we know is what we read on the internet or have seen on television or read on Facebook or heard on Fox or MSNBC, we're sitting ducks for misinformation and disinformation and even out-and-out propaganda. When the headline hucksters and purveyors of propaganda know that we'll not analyze anything or evaluate anything or think critically about anything, then they can say pretty much anything, and we'll buy it. Which is a way of saying that no skill is more practical and functional and necessary and needed than the skill of learning how to analyze arguments. That is, learning how to think critically. But unfortunately, critical thinking tends to conjure up in the minds of many big, thick, windy, ponderous tomes on logic, filled with Latin phrases like non sequitur and argumentum ad populum, and esoteric disciplines like symbolic logic and the like. And so most people just forego critical thinking altogether and settle into being the little lemmings on which the opinion makers have come to rely. And that's a shame, really, tragic even, because learning how to think critically about things is perhaps the single most important intellectual skill you'll ever master. You'll use it every day, not just in the classroom, but in the boardroom, in the coffee shop, at the checkout counter. You'll use it in everything you do, from reading the newspaper to listening to your friends debate the merits of the latest political issues to deciding whether or not the salesperson is telling you the truth, to talking about your faith with those who start from a very different point of view than that from which you start. But the question is, do I have to take a course in logic to learn how to think critically? The answer is no. In teaching critical thinking through the years, both to university students and to graduate students, I've developed a simple, easy way of teaching critical thinking that is at once easy to remember and practical to use. I call it the 3 A's of critical thinking. And so let's talk about the 3 A's of critical thinking. First of all, let me say a word about the nature of critical thinking itself. A working definition would be this: it is a method of evaluating ideas and information based on universal, intellectual, and by that I mean rational values. It assumes that there is a right way and a wrong way to think. There is a correct way and an incorrect way of reasoning. All thinking is not universally or equally valid. That is to say, it rejects the notion of ideological egalitarianism. All ideas are equally true. All ideas are equally valued. It's saying, well, everybody's got an opinion and no one's opinion is more valid than anybody else's. Well, of course, that's silly. That's nonsense if you give that even a moment's thought. Some opinions are based in fact and truth, and some opinions are not. Critical thinking engages in the analysis and evaluation of thought processes based on their inherent fidelity to reason and rational principles. That is, it reasons its way through invalid thinking, incorrect thinking, to correct and valid thinking. And so let's look at then the 3 A's of critical thinking. First of all, there are assumptions. What the person smuggles into the conversation, usually without stating it. We all come to conversations with assumptions. Sometimes we're aware of those assumptions, but generally, most of the time, we're not. Secondly, there are arguments. There are valid and invalid ways to argue. The uncovering and identification of logical fallacies is what critical thinking is all about in terms of the argumentation. Pointing out when someone's arguments are invalid, that is, irrational. And then finally, authorities. To what does one appeal to settle it? When you listen carefully to how people reason and how they think and how they argue, typically, if you back them in a corner, they're going to run to some authority, whether it's their personal experience or tradition or what the experts say or what their feelings tell them or perhaps the scripture. And then the question becomes, whose scripture? Or is it reason? And so let's look at these 3 A's, one after the other. First of all, let's begin with assumptions. Assumptions are things one brings to the conversation without realizing they're bringing them to the conversation. Let me give you an example I find often in many of my classes. Students will sometimes ask, why did you deduct 3 points on my discussion board? Well, there's an assumption there that's been smuggled into the conversation that the student hasn't stated. The assumption is, all discussion boards start out with a perfect score of 50 points merely for completing the assignment. Now, the student didn't say that, but they're clearly assuming that. They assume that if I just do the assignment, I get 50 points just for doing the assignment. Well, it doesn't take much thinking to realize that that's not the case. If that were the case, then there would be no accounting for merit, no accounting for quality of the assignment. Assumptions can be valid or invalid. Faulty assumptions invariably lead to faulty conclusions. So it's important to know what our assumptions are, to state those assumptions clearly, and to evaluate whether those assumptions are valid or invalid. The second A we're going to look at is arguments. All arguments appeal to reason, and only reason validates an argument. Hence, there are correct and incorrect arguments. It's not just a matter of one's opinion. Arguments can be true or they can be false. But when one says, your views have causes, not reasons, then a logical fallacy is introduced. Let me give you one that I encountered the other day in reading a student paper. The student said, liberal scholars support the North Galatian theory. Now, it's not my purpose here to talk about the North Galatian theory. I'm just talking about the student's argumentation. The inference is there is a cause for this person supporting the North Galatian theory, that is liberalism, rather than valid reasons. And so the person supports the North Galatian theory not because the North Galatian theory is true, but because they're liberal. Well, that's a logical fallacy. We call that an ad hominem fallacy. That's a fallacy in which we try to discredit the message by discrediting the messenger. Well, this person can't be correct because they're liberal. Well, the fact that they're liberal has nothing to do with the validity of their arguments. Their arguments are true or they're false. The North Galatian theory is true or false based solely on the merits of the evidence, irrespective of the views of the arguer. Let me give you another example. Even if a mass murderer says 3 times 3 equals 9, he's correct. Irrespective of what other shortcomings he may have, his arithmetic is good. And so let me talk briefly about logical fallacies. You can get a book on logic, or you can just Google these and find a more comprehensive list. But these are the most common logical fallacies. One is the straw man argument. It's misrepresenting someone's argument in order to discredit it. We make the worst, weakest case we can make and then discredit that and think we've discredited the person's argument, when in fact we have not. We've just discredited a weak version of the argument. And then, of course, the one we talked about a moment ago, the ad hominem fallacy. You think that if you attack the messenger, you've discredited the message. Well, that's not so at all. Just because the messenger may have flawed credentials doesn't mean the message itself is flawed. Another is called begging the question. It's a circular argument where the conclusion is included in the premise of the question. Here's an example. global warming must be true because it's contested only by those who believe, or only by those who disbelieve in global warming. Well, isn't that the question? Isn't that the very question being debated here? The question is not who believes it or who disbelieves it. The question is it true? And so question begging is a circular way of arguing where the conclusion is included in the premise or in the question. Another fallacy I see a lot is appeal to authority, asserting that because an expert thinks something is so, it must be so. Well, it doesn't matter how many experts you marshal on the side of a point of view. If they're wrong, they're wrong. This is a classic mistake students make. They think if they just put enough footnotes in an argument, they've proven it. But even if Albert Einstein says the moon is made out of green cheese, he's quite wrong. And so you can't just settle an argument by appealing to an authority. You must make the argument. You must present the evidence. Now, once you're making the argument, authorities can help support the argument, but you can't prove something just by appealing to the experts. Another fallacy is cherry picking the data, carefully picking the data to suit an argument and ignoring data that doesn't support that argument. Here's an example. Obese and overweight people eat more cottage cheese than do thin people. Therefore, eating cottage cheese is the leading cause of obesity. Well, it doesn't take but a moment's thought to realize how silly that is. What I've done is I've just carefully picked the data I want to look at, eating cottage cheese, and I've ignored any other data. That's a fallacy. The fallacy of false cause, presuming that a real relationship between things means that one caused the other. You can have correlation without causation. Here's an example. The data show that an increase in the bird population is coincident with the presence of blackbirds. With the presence of blackberries. Hence, birds cause blackberry plants to produce fruit. Well, of course, that's silly. The presence of birds when blackberry plants are fruiting is a correlation, but not a causation. Birds don't cause blackberry plants to fruit. They just show up when they do. So just because you have a correlation doesn't mean you have a causation. The fallacy of the false dilemma, where two alternatives are presented as the only possibilities when clearly more possibilities exist. The classic one you hear a lot is, you either agree with me or you're of the devil. Well, those can't be the only two alternatives. And then the anecdotal fallacy, where one uses personal experience or isolated example instead of proof and evidence and valid arguments. One example you hear a lot, my grandfather smoked 4 packs a day and lived to be 104. So don't believe all those bogus smoking studies that say smoking is bad for your health. Well, just because you've had one isolated example doesn't prove the point that you're making. And then the third A is authorities. To what does one appeal to settle an argument? An example from the hymn, the old hymn. You ask me how I know he lives within my heart. Well, that's an appeal to personal experience. And for the person whose experience that is, that's very powerful. That's very authoritative. But what if that's not your experience? You see, personal experience is just that. It's personal. It's yours. Experiences can be shared, but they're never the same. Your experience is not my experience, and my experience isn't yours. And so, experience is just one authority to which we appeal. It's not the only one. We can appeal to experts. We just talked about that. We can appeal to tradition. We can appeal to feelings. Well, how do you know that's true? Well, because I really feel it's true. Well, that doesn't prove it. It just proves you have strong feelings. What about Scripture? Well, if you appeal to Scripture, you realize that Muslims don't use the same Scripture we do. Buddhists don't use the same Scripture that Christians use. And so, whose Scripture are you going to use? Just because the Bible is authoritative for Christians doesn't mean it's authoritative for Muslims. What about reason? You can appeal to reason. So it's important to listen to the authorities to which one appeals. reason, when you're doing critical thinking, reason is the most reliable ground on which to appeal in critical thinking because it is universally objective, accessible, and valid. Let me give you an example. The only reason we can have an argument or debate about the city of Charlotte in North Carolina is because there's a real city of Charlotte. If Charlotte existed only in my experience, or in tradition, or in the beliefs of experts, there would be nothing objective to which I could appeal. There would be nothing objective to argue about. And by objective, I mean not yours and not mine, but ours. The only reason we can argue about the city of Charlotte is because there's a real city of Charlotte, accessible to both of us via reason and appeal to evidence. And so reason, then, is the most reliable ground on which to appeal in critical thinking because it's accessible to everybody. It's universally valid, universally objective. And so listen carefully to the authorities to which one appeals to settle an argument, and then ask, how reasonable is that appeal to authority? Finally, and quickly, let me do a case study. Let me give you an example, something that happened to me just the other day. Critical thinking, again, is not something you just do on term papers or research papers in college or graduate school. You engage in critical thinking every time you watch a news report, every time you read an article on the internet, every time you have a conversation at Starbucks. Critical thinking is a skill that you use every time you engage in some sort of human intercourse. And it can happen in the most innocuous ways. My wife was shopping just yesterday in Asheville, and I was sitting on a bench waiting for her to finish, and I noticed that next to me on the bench was a gospel tract. The gospel tract had the title, it was an anti-Mormon gospel tract, and it had the title, Why Mormonism Isn't Christian. I picked it up and instinctively started engaging in critical thinking. When I read the tract, the answer the tract gave is, Mormonism isn't Christian because they worship a different Jesus. And then it went on to say, the Mormon Jesus is a different Jesus from the Christian Jesus. And they cited as an authority 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4, where Paul says, for if someone comes and preaches another Jesus than the one we preached, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you submit to it readily enough. And so they cite 2 Corinthians 11:4 as a way of saying, Mormons have come preaching another Jesus than the one we preached, the one Paul preached, or the Christian Jesus. And so the conclusion is Mormonism isn't Christian because the Mormon Jesus is a different Jesus from the Christian Jesus. Now let me pause and say this. I'm not interested at this point in evaluating the merits of whether or not that statement is true, whether or not Mormonism is Christian. That's not what I'm interested in here. I'm looking at how the argument is made in this tract, and I'm showing you how to engage in critical thinking. There are two problems with the way the tract made the argument from the perspective of critical thinking. First of all, the tract engages in question begging. Isn't this precisely the question in dispute? Do Mormons worship a different Jesus? And yet the tract doesn't argue that. It doesn't present evidence that that is the case. It assumes the very conclusion being debated. That's a logical fallacy. It's called question begging. You don't engage in an argument or a conversation or discussion by assuming the very question in dispute. And then the second problem from the perspective of critical thinking is that no evidence is cited. Only an authority, and the authority they cite is Paul in 2 Corinthians 11:4. But if I'm a Mormon or a Muslim or a Buddhist or anyone else who doesn't regard Paul as a primary authority, how convincing is it to cite the Christian canon as authoritative? The only ones who are going to be convinced by citing such an authority are those who are already convinced. And so, as a tool for doing critical thinking, the tract was poorly done. It doesn't think on a critical level very well, because it engages in logical fallacies, question begging, and it cites an authority rather than evidence. And so critical thinking assumes that a valid appeal can be made to a universally accessible and valid intellectual value, namely reason. And so let me summarize. The 3 A's of critical thinking are these: assumptions, what the person smuggles into the conversation, usually without stating it; arguments, there are valid and invalid ways to argue. And so we uncover and identify the logical fallacies, the faulty thinking, the wrong thinking in the person's arguments. And then authorities. To what does one appeal to settle it? Experience, tradition, experts, scriptures, or to reason? Well, I hope this little excursion into critical thinking has helped you to feel more comfortable with your own ability to analyze and weigh and evaluate the arguments and debate and discussion you hear around you every day, all the time. And so until next time, take care. God bless.